The limestone face rose 73 feet above the Niagara River Valley, and Martha Lindstrom was carving into it with a determination that made the local homesteaders nervous. February 1877, northeastern Nebraska Territory, and the Swedish widow had been working the cave entrance for 6 weeks straight, not expanding it outward where everyone could see what she was doing, carving inward into the solid rock behind the natural opening, creating something the other settlers couldn't quite figure out. The temperature sat at 40 FRR that morning, unseasonably warm for Dakota country, but Martha knew better than to trust it. She'd been chipping away at the back wall of the shallow cave since early January, and the pile of limestone fragments outside had grown to 4 feet high. The cave itself wasn't impressive from the outside. Just a 12-T wide opening that went back maybe 15 feet before narrowing to nothing. Every homesteader along the Niagara had seen a dozen just like it, but Martha wasn't interested in the cave as it was. She was interested in what the rock could become. The first person to call her foolish was Garrett Morrison, and he had the credentials to back up his opinion. Former Army engineer, built 3 bridges across the Republican River, surveyed 14 townships for the railroad he'd ridden out from. His claimed 7 miles west specifically to tell Martha she was wasting her time. "You're weakening the whole rock face," he'd said, watching her work the iron chisel against the back wall. "That overhang's going to come down on your head, and they'll find you in spring thaw with a ton of limestone for a headstone." Martha had kept working, the mallet striking in steady rhythm. She was 41 years old, stood 5 feet 3, and weighed maybe 110 pounds, soaking wet. Her husband, Neil, had died of typhoid 16 months earlier, leaving her with 80 acres, a sod house that leaked, and 3 surviving children to feed. She didn't have time for lectures from men who thought they knew better. "The rock's been here since before the glaciers," she'd said without looking up. "It'll be here after we're gone." Garrett had ridden away, shaking his head, but he wasn't the last to question her judgment. The winter of 187,677 had been strange from the start. Warm spells that lasted too long, followed by cold snaps that came on too fast. The Lakota families who still trapped along the Niagara told anyone who'd listened that the weather was wrong, that the signs pointed towards something dangerous building. But most homesteaders had learned to tune out warnings that didn't come with specific dates and times. Weather was weather, you dealt with it when it arrived. Martha had arrived in Nebraska Territory in 1871 with Niels and their 4 children, part of a wave of Swedish immigrants who'd been promised fertile land and opportunity. What they'd gotten was 120 summers, winters that could drop to 45 below zero, and soil so thick with roots it took to men and for oxen to break a single acre. Their first winter, they lived in a dugout carved into a hillside, and Martha had watched her youngest son die of pneumonia in a space that couldn't hold heat, no matter how much buffalo chip they burned. The sod house Niels built their second year was better, but not by much. Walls 18 and thick, roof supported by cottonwood logs hauled 15 miles from the nearest grove. It kept out the worst of the wind, but in a true Dakota blizzard, the temperature inside would drop to freezing, even with the stove going full blast. You'd wake up with frost on the blankets and ice in the water bucket. That's just how it was. But Martha had noticed something during their winters in the dugout. Back in that hole in the ground, the temperature stayed constant. It didn't matter if it was 100 outside or 30 below, that dugout held at about 55 year-round. The earth itself was a regulator, pulling heat in summer and giving it back in winter. She'd watched the same phenomenon in root cellars, in wells, in any space that went deep enough to escape the surface extremes. The cave she'd found in November while searching for a spring that wouldn't freeze had given her an idea. What if you could combine the thermal stability of underground space with the natural shelter of rock? What if you didn't just use the cave as it was, but made it better, made it deeper, made it retain heat more efficiently, made it a place where a family could survive conditions that would kill them in a conventional structure? The other homesteaders thought she should be focused on spring planting, on fixing her sod house roof, on the dozen practical concerns that came with running a claim alone. Instead, she was out here every day working rock with tools she'd borrowed from the blacksmith in Niagara Station, 15 miles southeast. If you want to see what happened when one woman's stubbornness met the worst blizzard in Dakota Territory history, go ahead and hit that like button because this story gets a whole lot worse. Before it gets better, Thomas Brennan was the second skeptic, and he approached the situation differently than Garrett Morrison. Thomas ran cattle on a claim that bordered Martha's to the north, and he'd survived on the plains since 1869. He knew cold, he knew wind, he knew what happened to people who got creative with their winter preparations. Instead of sticking with proven methods, he showed up at the cave site in mid-January with his son Patrick, both of them on horseback, both of them dressed for the cold snap that had moved in overnight. The temperature had dropped to 8 and a north wind was making it feel closer to 20 below. Mrs. Lindstrom, Thomas said, dismounting carefully. He was 53, built like a barrel with hands that had broken ice from water troughs through 9 Dakota. Winters, I'm going to speak plain because I respect your late husband's memory. What you're doing here is dangerous. Martha had been mixing mortar, combining clay from the riverbank with crushed limestone and water. The pile of material sat steaming slightly in the cold air. She looked up, her breath making clouds in the February morning. Dangerous. How you're creating a death trap. Thomas said, you get caught in there when the temperature drops. That cave's going to fill with your own breath moisture. It'll freeze on the walls, freeze in your lungs, freeze your children from the inside out. I've seen it happen to miners. Seen it happen to fur trappers, enclosed spaces in extreme cold are killers. Patrick nodded agreement, though he kept his mouth shut. The boy was 19, and he'd learned when to let his father do the talking. Martha straightened up, wiping her hands on a rag that was more ice than cloth. You ever notice how a root cellar stays warm in winter? Root cellar's different, Thomas said. That's underground, insulated by earth on all sides. Your cave's got one wall open to the elements. Soon as that wind starts blowing, any heat you generate is gone, unless you modify the opening. Martha said. She pointed to a pile of cottonwood logs stacked near the cave entrance. Double wall system, outer wall with an offset entrance, inner wall with proper sealing creates an airlock effect. Cold air can't blow straight in. Warm air can't blow straight out. Thomas looked at the logs, then back at Martha. Who taught you that? My father was a shipwright in Karlskrona, Martha said. Built vessels that sailed the Baltic in January. You learn about insulation when your life depends on it. This was the kind of detail that made Thomas pause. Not book learning, not theory. Practical knowledge passed down from someone who'd actually solved similar problems in a different context. But he wasn't convinced. Even if your airlock works, where's the heat coming from? You can't keep a fire burning in there. Smoke's got nowhere to go. Who said anything about fire? Martha asked. She gestured toward the back of the cave where her excavation work had created a chamber that extended another 8 feet into the hillside. Thermal mass, heat from bodies, heat from the rock itself. The deeper you go, the warmer it gets. Stable temperature, no fuel required. That won't save you in a real blizzard, Thomas said. When it hits 40 below and the wind's blowing 60 meters an hour, your thermal mass won't mean a damn thing. Martha picked up her chisel and mallet. Then I guess we'll find out. Thomas and Patrick rode away convinced she'd be dead by spring, but at least they tried to warn her. Anna Kowalski was the third skeptic, and her concern came from a different place. Anna ran the trading post at Niagara Station and had become something like a friend to Martha over the years. She showed up in late January bringing supplies, 20 pounds of tallow, 16 yards of canvas, rope, and 3 wool blankets. Anna was 37, polished by birth, practical by necessity. She'd lost her husband to a farming accident in 1874 and knew exactly how hard it was to survive alone on the frontier. You're scaring people, Anna said, helping unload. Half the settlement thinks you've lost your mind, and the other half, Martha asked, thinks you're too stubborn to live through what's coming. Anna examined the outer wall taking shape. Why not just improve the sod house? Because I did that last winter, Martha said. Burned to cords of wood and still watched ice form on the inside. Walls, the children coughed for months. My daughter Ellen almost died. Anna knew about Ellen. The girl was 9, small for her age with lungs that couldn't handle prolonged cold. Another winter in that sod house might kill her, Anna walked into. The cave, temperature inside was maybe 15 or even warmer than outside despite the open entrance. The walls showed fresh chisel marks where Martha had expanded the chamber. Back wall carved into a curved surface for better air circulation. Floor leveled and covered with sand. And gravel for drainage. I'm building insurance, Martha said. If winter stays mild, we stay in the house. If it doesn't, we have options. Options that might collapse and kill you, Anna said, stating facts not being cruel. Garrett Morrison knows rocks. If he says the overhang's unstable, Garrett Morrison knows engineering. Martha interrupted, but he doesn't know this rock. I've tested every inch, solid limestone. No cracks, no erosion, it's been here for 10,000 years. Anna examined the expanded chamber, ceiling about 6.5 feet tall, width varying from 8 to 12 feet, depth now 23 feet from entrance. Not huge, but enough space for a family of 4 if conditions got bad. What about air? Anna asked. You seal this up tight, you'll suffocate. Ventilation system, Martha said, pointing to a narrow channel along the ceiling angling upward connecting to a natural fissure, leading to the surface. Passive airflow, warm air rises, gets pulled out the top, draws fresh air in through the entrance gap. Anna had to admit it was clever. But clever didn't mean safe, Martha. You're one of the smartest women I've met on this frontier, but sometimes the smart thing is knowing when you're outmatched. I'm not trying to outsmart Winter, Martha said. I'm trying to work with it. Anna left without being convinced. But she didn't try to stop Martha either. That was the frontier way. Everyone had the right to make their own mistakes. The fourth skeptic didn't arrive until February, and he came with credentials none of the others could match. His name was Samuel White, and he was Northern Cheyenne, born and raised in country that made the Niagara Valley look gentle by comparison. He'd guided army surveys, trapped beaver from Montana to Missouri, and survived conditions that had killed men half his age. He was 61 years old, and he'd been watching Martha's work with growing concern. Samuel showed up on a morning when the temperature had dropped back to 14 riding a paint horse that looked as weathered as its owner. He didn't dismount right away, just sat there studying the cave entrance, the excavation work, the double wall system Martha had constructed. Finally, he climbed down and walked to where Martha was working on the inner wall. She was fitting stones into a framework of cottonwood, creating a thermal mass barrier that would hold heat during temperature swings. You're building a winter lodge wrong, Samuel said. It wasn't an insult, just an observation. Martha set down the rock she'd been positioning. Show me the right way. That surprised him. Most white settlers got defensive when you criticized their methods, but Martha had asked a direct question, and Samuel appreciated directness. Winter lodge needs fire, he said, needs smoke hole position to create draft, needs insulation that breathes, hides bark, grass. Your system traps moisture, creates condensation, makes cold worse. Fire needs fuel, Martha countered. I don't have enough wood to burn through a week-long blizzard, let alone a month. And I can't risk my children dying from smoke inhalation if the ventilation fails. Samuel studied her for a long moment. You've thought about this every day since November. He walked into the cave, examining the work with the eye of someone who understood survival architecture. At a fundamental level, the curved back wall, the drainage system, the ventilation channel, these weren't random choices. They showed understanding of how air moved, how water behaved, how rock conducted and stored heat. Your father taught you this, he asked. Some of it, the rest I learned from watching what? Badger dens, prairie dog colonies, how they build underground, how they stay warm without fire. Martha joined him in the cave, pointing to features she'd incorporated. Tunnel entrance to slow wind, multiple chambers for temperature regulation, ventilation that works with natural convection, Samuel nodded slowly. Animals know. They've been doing this longer than any of us. That's what I figured. He turned to face her directly. I came here to tell you this was foolish that you'd freeze your family trying to be clever. But Martha asked, but you might know something the rest of us have forgotten. He walked back to the entrance, examining the airlock system. Your outer wall needs to be higher. To feed higher with an overhang that deflects wind upward, and your inner wall needs a thermal break, air gap between the stone, and then the wood stops conductive heat loss. Martha grabbed a piece of charred wood and started sketching on a flat rock. Working out the modifications Samuel described, like this, exactly like that. He watched her draw for a moment, then added, you'll also need emergency food storage. Not in the living space. Separate cache sealed against moisture and vermin and water. Lots of water stored where it won't freeze. They spent the next hour discussing modifications. Improvements, backup systems. By the time Samuel left, Martha had a list of 17 additional changes that would make the cave shelter more effective. More important, she had validation from someone who understood winter survival in a way the homesteaders never would. One more thing, Samuel said as he mounted his horse. When the storm comes, and it's coming, don't wait until you see snow. Whether this wrong doesn't announce itself. You'll feel it in the air, in the pressure. Move your family before the sky changes. How will I know? Martha asked. You'll know, Samuel said and rode away. If you're starting to think maybe Martha was onto something, maybe her plan wasn't as crazy as everyone thought, that's exactly when you need to subscribe. Because what happens next proved she wasn't just smart, she was right about things the experts completely missed, and that knowledge saved more than just her own family. The work intensified through February. Martha modified the outer wall according to Samuel's suggestions, raising it to 7 feet with an angled overhang that would deflect wind. She created the thermal break in the inner wall, leaving a 3-in air gap between stone and wood. She carved 2 small chambers, one for food storage, one for water. The water chamber stayed at a constant 47 drawer regardless of outside conditions. Her children helped when they could. Ellen carried water despite her weak lungs. Sven positioned heavy stones. Christina managed household chores Martha couldn't ignore. The neighbors watched. Some called it Martha's folly. Others, after Samuel's visit became known, started asking questions. Anna mentioned that 3 families had inquired about thermal mass and ventilation. Things they'd never cared about before. The weather stayed strange. Mid-February brought 50 to degra melting snow, and suggesting early spring. 3 days later, 6 degra overnight with no warning. The whipsaw pattern continued. Thomas Brennan stopped by in late February to apologize. I still think you're taking a hell of a risk, he said, but Samuel doesn't give approval lightly. He paused. If this works, will you share how you did it? Other families have children who can't handle extreme cold. I'll share everything, Martha said. Every measurement, every technique, every mistake, but only if it works. By March 1st, the shelter was complete. Food cache stocked with dried beans, cornmeal, salt pork, hardtack, enough for people for 3 weeks. Water storage held 40 gallons in sealed clay vessels. Dried prairie grass and buffalo robes for bedding, plus the wool blankets from Anna. Total excavation approximately 183 cubic feet beyond natural cave space. 8 tons of limestone removed over 12 weeks by one woman with hand tools. Thermal mass wall 40,200 pounds of stone to store and radiate heat during cold periods. Most impressive was the ventilation system. Martha had expanded the natural fissure to a channel 8 in wide from cave ceiling to surface. The top was covered with a stone cap, allowing air exchange while preventing rain or snow from falling through. The system created natural draft, warm air rising and escaping, cool, fresh air pulled in through the entrance gap. Exchange rate was slow enough not to rapidly cool the space, but fast enough to prevent carbon dioxide buildup or moisture accumulation. Garrett Morrison came back in early March to inspect the finished shelter. He spent an hour examining every detail, checking structural integrity, testing stability. measuring ventilation airflow with string held near the ceiling channel. When he emerged, his expression had changed. "You've built something I've never seen before," he said. "It shouldn't work as well as I think it's going to work, but if the overhang holds, if your ventilation doesn't freeze, if your thermal mass performs as calculated, yes, it'll work." He paused. "Those are 3 significant ifs, Mrs. Lindstrom. I've tested everything I can test," Martha said. "The rest is in God's hands." March continued erratically. Warm days, sudden freezes, snow flurries from nowhere. The Lakota family started moving south earlier than usual. Homesteaders noticed but dismissed it as overcaution. Samuel White stopped by one more time on March 17th. The temperature was 39. Cloudy but calm. He didn't get off his horse this time, just sat there looking at the sky with an expression Martha had learned to read. "It's coming," he said. When? Martha asked. "Soon, maybe 3 days, maybe 5, but soon." He looked down at her, his face serious. "When you feel the pressure change, when your ears tell you something's wrong, even though you can't see anything wrong, that's when you move. Don't wait for snow. Don't wait for wind, just move." "I will," Martha promised. "Bring the others, too," Samuel said. "Brennan, Kowalski, the Hoffmans, anyone who will listen. Your shelter's big enough for 12 people if you pack them tight. You think it'll be that bad?" "I think this winter's been building towards something the frontier hasn't seen before," Samuel said, "and when it hits, the only people who survive will be the ones who prepared for the impossible." He rode away without another word, heading south with his family toward their winter camp in the Sandhills. The pressure change came. On March 21st, just after dawn, Martha felt it before she understood what she was feeling. A tightness in her chest, a sense of the air being too heavy, too thick. The temperature was 444 degrees of warmer than it had been in days. The sky was clear. There was no wind. Everything looked perfect. Everything felt wrong, Martha sensed then. To warn the Brennan, she sent Christina to Niabra Station to tell Anna. She stayed at the homestead with Ellen, packing supplies, preparing to move. The sod house suddenly felt fragile, temporary, like it was built from materials that would dissolve at the first real test. By midday, the temperature had risen to 51. Neighbors started laughing at Martha's warning. "Storm in this weather." Thomas Brennan's wife, Sarah, said, "Martha, honey, you've been working too hard." But Thomas himself wasn't laughing. He'd lived through enough Dakota winters to know that when the weather felt wrong, you didn't ignore it just because it looked right. He started moving supplies toward the cave shelter just in case. Anna Kowalski showed up at 3 o'clock in the afternoon with her nephew, Jacob, the 11-year-old with weak lungs. "I don't know if you're right," Anna said, "but I'm not risking the boy." The Hoffmans arrived an hour later. Wilhelm, his wife Clara, and their 3 children. Wilhelm had lost 2 daughters the previous winter, and he wasn't taking chances anymore. By nightfall, 11 people were sheltered in the cave, Martha and her 3 children, Thomas Brennan and his son Patrick, Anna and her nephew Jacob, and the 3 Hoffmans. The temperature outside was still 47 air. The sky was still clear. There was still no wind. "Maybe it's nothing," Wilhelm said, trying to convince himself. "Maybe," Martha agreed. But she'd sealed the canvas entrance tight, and she wasn't opening it until morning at the earliest. The pressure kept building through the night. Everyone felt it, even the children. Something vast and cold was moving toward them across the plains, something that made the air itself feel heavy with anticipation. At 17 in the morning, Martha knew the exact time because she was awake, checking the ventilation, making sure everything was working. The temperature started dropping, not gradually, not over hours, in 15 minutes. It went from 45 off to 28 ris. In another 10 minutes, it hit 12. By 3 a.m., the wind arrived, not a breeze, not a gust, a sustained roar that hit the cave entrance like a physical force. The canvas barrier flexed but held, the double wall system doing exactly what Martha had designed it to do. The outer wall caught the initial impact, deflected it upward. The inner wall absorbed what got through the 3-in-air gap, preventing conductive heat loss. Inside the cave, the temperature held at 52. At 4 a.m., the snow started, not flakes, not a gentle accumulation, a white wall that reduced visibility to zero. The wind was blowing at speeds nobody could measure, driving the snow horizontally, creating drifts that grew 6 in every hour. Thomas Brennan checked the entrance seal at dawn, opening it just enough to look outside, the drift against the cave. Entrance was already 4 feet high. The temperature had dropped to 6 hours. And that was before accounting for wind chill, with the wind blowing the way it was. The effective temperature was probably 35 below zero. Sweet Jesus, Thomas muttered. Sealing the entrance again, the blizzard continued for 41 hours without pause. The temperature outside bottomed out at 19 below zero, with wind speeds estimated at 60 to 70 miles per hour. The effective temperature, the combination of actual temperature and wind chill, reached 58 below zero, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in 90 seconds, cold enough to kill an unprotected human in less than 10 minutes. The homesteaders saw houses, those structures that had seemed so solid and practical, couldn't maintain interior temperatures above 15, even with fires burning constantly. The wind found every gap, every imperfection, every weakness in the construction. Ice formed on interior walls, water buckets froze solid. People wrapped in every blanket they owned still shivered uncontrollably. 7 families tried to ride out the storm in their homes. 3 succeeded, barely, 4 didn't. By the time the blizzard ended on March 23rd, 14 people were dead across the Niagara Valley settlement, frozen in their homes, frozen trying to reach their livestock, frozen in structures they thought would protect them inside Martha's cave shelter. The temperature never dropped below 49 off of the thermal mass wall performed exactly as designed, storing heat from the occupants' bodies and radiating it back into the space. The ventilation system continued working throughout the storm, the heated air rising and escaping through the ceiling channel while fresh air was pulled in through the entrance gap. The double wall system prevented the brutal external cold from penetrating the interior. The depth of the excavation kept them far enough into the hillside that the surrounding rock temperature stayed stable. 11 people survived in a space that shouldn't have worked, using principles that contradicted everything the experienced homesteaders thought they knew about winter shelter. When the storm finally ended and Thomas Brennan opened the entrance, they found a landscape transformed. Snow drifts reached 12 to 15 feet in places. The temperature was still 8 below zero. Every structure they could see showed damage, collapsed. Roofs, broken windows, sections of wall torn away by the wind. Martha's sod house was gone, just gone. The roof had collapsed under snow load. The walls had fallen inward, and the whole structure had been buried under an 8-FT drift. If they'd been inside, they'd all be dead. You saved our lives, Anna Kowalski said, standing in the cave entrance, staring at the destruction outside. The cave saved our lives, Martha corrected. I just made it better. The aftermath was devastating. 14 dead, dozens of livestock frozen, structures destroyed across the settlement. But the 11 people who trusted Martha's judgment were alive and healthy. And that fact changed everything. Within days, homesteaders were visiting the cave shelter, studying every detail. Garrett Morrison brought surveying equipment and documented the design with engineering precision. This needs to be shared, he said. Every settlement from here to Montana needs to know what you did. Martha showed him everything. The excavation technique, the thermal mass calculations, the ventilation system. She held nothing back. It only works if people actually build them, she said. Thomas Brennan organized help to rebuild Martha's homestead structures, this time incorporating her principles. The new house was 60% more efficient than the old sod house had been. Other families followed suit. The Hoffmans built a hybrid shelter. Anna Kowalski financed a community storm shelter near Nio Station by 1880. Variations of Martha's design were being used across 4 territories. The principles became standard elements of frontier cold weather construction. What made it particularly valuable was its scalability. A single family could excavate a version in 4 to 6 weeks using hand tools. Materials were local. Skills were basic. Anyone who could use a chisel could do the work. Weather records show the 1877 blizzard was one of the most intense cold air outbreaks ever recorded on the northern plains, with temperature drops of more than 70 bars in less than 24 hours. Modern analysis suggests wind chill reached 65 below zero. Martha never claimed to have invented anything. "I just watched how animals survived and copied what worked," she'd say. But that humility didn't change the fact that she'd saved lives. Through observation, calculation, and stubborn refusal to accept that traditional methods were sufficient. Samuel Whitehorse visited in April 1878, bringing his grandson to see the cave shelter. "This is what happens when you pay attention to the land," he told the boy. "When you learn from what's already here instead of forcing the land to accept what you bring." Martha offered coffee, and they talked about knowledge belonging to the land rather than to people. Samuel shared the design with Cheyenne families in Powder River Country. The exchange went both ways: traditional indigenous knowledge informing homesteader construction, homesteader innovations adapted by native families who saw value in the hybrid approach. Modern archaeology has found these hybrid shelters across the northern Great Plains, identified by their thermal mass walls and ventilation channels features, appearing suddenly in the late 1870s, exactly when Martha's design spread through frontier communities. What archaeologists note: the shelters that survived the longest were built by communities rather than individuals. Knowledge worked best when shared, tested, and improved through collective experience. The cave shelter Martha built remained functional for decades, serving as emergency refuge through multiple brutal winters. By 1885, the community had 4 additional storm shelters based on her design, distributed so no family was more than 3 miles from emergency refuge. Martha lived until 1904, dying at age 68 when people asked about the greatest innovation she'd witnessed in her lifetime. Automobiles, telephones, electric lights. She always pointed to the cave shelter. "Everything else made life easier," she'd say. "That made life possible." Ellen, the daughter with weak lungs who'd inspired everything, survived to age 43. She raised 6 children in Nebraska, none dying from cold-related illness. That alone justified everything Martha had done. If you found value in this story, if you're thinking about the frontier families who survived because one woman questioned assumptions and learn from the land, then subscribe to keep these stories alive. There are dozens more accounts of people who saved lives by refusing to accept that traditional methods were the only methods. Everyone deserves to be remembered. The cave shelter still exists on private land, protected by descendants of families Martha saved. The entrance has been modified, but the basic structure remains unchanged. The thermal mass wall still stands. The excavation still extends 23 feet into the hillside. Temperature inside still holds at approximately 50 off regardless of external conditions. Visitors report feeling the weight of decisions made 148 years ago. That meant the difference between extinction and survival for multiple family lines. Every descendant of a Niagara Valley settler owes their existence to choices made in February and March 1877. That's what makes frontier stories like Martha's matter. They're proof that individual determination applied to genuine problems with life or death stakes can change outcomes. One woman with hand tools and knowledge borrowed from multiple sources saved 11 lives directly and hundreds indirectly as the design spread. She did it by refusing to accept that the way things had always been done was the only way they could be done. That lesson echoes across 148 years. That the margin between success and failure often comes down to observation, preparation, and humility to learn from sources others dismiss. If that's the kind of knowledge you value, if you want to preserve these stories of frontier survival and the lessons they contain, subscribe to this channel and help keep traditional wisdom alive. The world needs to remember people like Martha Lindstrom, people who saved lives by questioning everything and building something better than what tradition offered. And maybe we need to remember that the capacity for that kind of innovation hasn't disappeared, it's just waiting for conditions that make it necessary again.